senior contributor for Young Voices. Up late with me tonight on the Final Five is Brad Polumbo. Brad, great to see you.
Hey, thanks.
So I want to start with this bombshell story from The Atlantic that alleges, according to four anonymous sources, that President Trump mocked U.S. soldiers killed in battle and that he skipped a visit to a veterans cemetery in France because rainy conditions could mess up his hair. Now, the White House saying this report is fake news. Take a listen.
The Atlantic reporting is based on four cowardly anonymous sources who probably do not even exist. Meanwhile, within hours, 10 sources, 10, went on the record debunking these lies, 8 with firsthand knowledge, stating on the record one common truth, that this story is false.
Now, since the report came out, Brad, two former senior Trump administration officials are confirming the reporting with Fox News, but again, they are staying anonymous. So if the allegations are this serious, it does beg the question of why no one is going on record.
It absolutely does. And here's the thing. I mean, obviously, if these comments were actually made by the president, they're horrible, absolutely inexcusable. But we can't just go and assume that because a few anonymous sources said so, that that's enough to go and jump to that conclusion, especially when you have people on the record saying this didn't happen. And that's why I really question the decision. I mean, anonymous sources are understandable in some circumstances. When you have intense national security information or people who could be in jeopardy or danger from speaking out. But if these are former Trump administration officials, then there's no reason. They're not working in the government anymore. There's no reason they couldn't put their name behind it. There's no good reason, at least. So the fact that they're not really is a red flag to this story.
Now, President Trump saying that he's never said anything disparaging about a military veteran, frankly, we know is not true. I mean, we can't forget the comments that then candidate Trump made about the late Arizona Senator John McCain and how he's not a war hero because he was captured. And just last year, President Trump referred to his former Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, a highly decorated Marine, calling him the world's most overrated general. So is the president's past comments going to hurt him with this?
So it's an interesting one because no one can deny the fact that the president has said offensive and disparaging things about veterans like John McCain. What he said about John McCain was awful. But I'm not comfortable leaping to the conclusion that because, this sounds like something he would say. As a journalist, that's not good enough for me. We can't be running with that. So hold President Trump accountable for the things we've proven that he has said. But I think people are getting way ahead of the gun on this one when we simply don't know. And there's so many things to criticize Trump for that you don't have to rely on anonymous sources. Focus your criticisms on things. If you're a Democrat or if you're a member of the liberal media, focus your criticisms on things like that he's actually on video saying, right, rather than this whole anonymous sources game.
Yeah, and with the anonymous sources, does that just kind of play into President Trump's messaging that this is fake news?
Well, who is convinced by this? That's my question. Everybody who supports the president is going to look at this and go, oh, fake news, right? And everybody who doesn't like the president is going to look at this and say, yeah, how horrible. So that's why these stories frustrate me, right? Because Jeffrey Goldberg at The Atlantic, he should have known that this is exactly what would happen if you proceeded with the only anonymous sources. And he really should have pushed one of them to go on the record, or maybe sat on the story and done some more digging, because the inevitable fate of this story, the way that it was thinly sourced and anonymously sourced, is that everyone's just going to believe what their side tells them to believe. And that's not how good journalism is supposed to be received.
Right. Much more to come from that. All right. I want to talk about the racial justice protests across the country. President Trump doubling down on his threat that he is serious about withholding federal funds from states and cities that he deems lawless zones. But under what authority, Brad, can he even do this?
Well, that's a good question about withholding the money. I think President Trump is right to be upset that we have seen Democrat mayors and city officials like Ted Wheeler in Portland allow for a collapse of the rule of law in some parts of their cities. And they've stood back and watched as looting and rioting has ravaged urban minority communities and small businesses, and it will leave scars for decades to come. Now, President Trump, ultimately, though, that's not his authority and that's not his business, right? Policing is a state and local matter, so there's only so much that he can do other than say what they should do. But that's, at the end of the day, that is up to state and local politicians, and they're the ones who should be held accountable by their constituents for any shortcomings.
You know, to that point, though, the president continues to insult these Democratic governors and mayors, saying they're weak, that if they don't handle it, he will. He's even tweeting accounts of his own supporters, some of whom have caused trouble in some of these cities. He also did not forcibly condemn the acts of the shooter in Kenosha, Wisconsin, that killed 2 protesters. So do you think this kind of rhetoric is inciting violence and actually making it more difficult for these mayors and governors to reach out for help?
Well, I wouldn't say it's inciting violence, because that takes it a step of a causal link that we just don't know. But it does fan the flames, right? The President Trump is not known for his restraint and diplomatic language. He is certainly making things worse and piling onto the fire. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the problem is that you have people out there burning down stores and shattering windows and looting businesses in the name of justice. But when they're hurting people, I mean, 15 people died in the various forms in the immediate aftermath of the George Floyd riots. Not the peaceful protests, but the riots that broke out in some cities. So we're not just talking about broken windows here. We're talking about serious crime and vandalism and destruction. And that's the biggest problem, even if President Trump is certainly not helping matters with his tweets and remarks.
I think the goal here is to unite the country. Looting and rioting isn't helping. And just finally here, do you think we're losing the message of these protests that sparked with the death of George Floyd?
Well, we are, and that's a fact, actually. There's studies showing drops in support for the criminal justice reform message and movement, and that's a shame because it's an important one. But peaceful protest is the way to achieve change, not destructive vandalism and violence.
All right, I think that's a universal message everyone can agree on. Brad Polumbo, thanks so much for staying up with us. We'll be right back.